Hi, this is Mr. Smith, and this is Honors Economics Unit 1. This is just a brief overview of macroeconomics in this introduction unit. And so let me begin by talking about just that, the macroeconomic perspective. First, we'll look at measuring the size of the economy, the gross domestic product, which is the statistic that you see the most when you look at the United States and its economic power. You often see its GDP, which in the year 2020 is at $21.4 or so trillion dollars, which is enormous. And that's the way we usually evaluate and compare other countries as well. Then adjusting nominal values to real values, because we do have to take things like inflation into consideration, tracking real GDP over time, comparing it to previous years and seeing the growth rate, or if there are possible contractions, which indicate recessions if they occur for 6 months or longer. And then comparing GDP among countries, because that basically gives us a look at the size of an economy, and which is also related to, of course, is geography and population, because obviously a small country with limited natural resources or people is going to have lower GDP. But if it's comparable in some way, and if we take the statistics and melt them down by per capita, for instance, per person, that will obviously give us a comparison, even if there's a difference in size. And how well GDP measures the well-being of a society. So is this a good look at exactly how well off this country is? So the Great Depression is probably one of the times in American history where we saw the decline of the gross domestic product. At the time, it was referred to as the gross national product because it was any American companies and their productivity, how much was that worth. But as globalization and relocation of resources, especially factory work in particular, has spread out the American national corporations throughout the world. And we now take that into perspective with the gross domestic product, which is everything produced within our borders. Well, we'll talk more about that later. But anyway, the GNP at the time declined quite a bit in this country and in others. And so it was one of the most significant economic contractions that has occurred in world history, especially in the industrial age. Macroeconomic goals for any society should be economic growth. Are you producing more than before? Is your GDP going up? Low unemployment, preferably between 4 and 6%, which is the natural rate of unemployment. When it's 4 to 6%, we usually see the naturally occurring unemployment levels, the types, which include people going back and forth between the workplaces, which is called frictional unemployment, when people are laid off temporarily because of the time of the year doesn't fit with the industry that you're in. That's known as seasonal unemployment. And then structural unemployment is when their job training, their human capital doesn't match the workforce that is hiring at the time. So those three exist all the time. And you need that unemployment, because if you want to start a new business or expand your business, you need to hire them from somewhere. And so you get them from that pool of unemployed people. And then, of course, there's low inflation, keeping prices stable, preferably below 3%, which is known as creeping inflation. That makes budgets predictable, future prices predictable, doesn't erode people's savings as much. And so that is the guaranteed rate that people would like to see in an economy. And then, what do they look at? What do they prime? Aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So that is the total amount of demand and the total amount of supply in an economy. So demand for everything, consumption of everything, stuff that people are buying, stuff that businesses are buying, and stuff that the government's buying. And then aggregate supply is everything being produced by businesses, all the goods and services they're producing, the sale of labor by individual people, and then the supply of public goods and services from the government. And then Keynesian economic model and neoclassical model are two different outlooks. Keynesian really looks at demand side in particular, and it hopes to prime consumption, and they do that by two key factors that we'll talk more about later, which would be lowering interest rates, which makes loans more attractive, which means people will get them, which means people will buy more. And then the other part of his would be the government increasing spending. So it becomes a big consumer and increases demand, aggregate demand as well. And the neoclassical model is what we have used throughout the centuries, going back to the time of Adam Smith, the classical model, Adam Smith, which is laissez-faire, limited government, the invisible hand, the marketplace itself, and a natural occurrence will work itself out, so no need to pay attention to these problems. The neoclassical model is just a slight difference. So the Keynesian model concentrates on macroeconomics through the demand perspective, the demand side. Neoclassical looks at it from the supply side usually. And so what happened in 1960s was Keynesian economics had reached its peak. In the 1970s, there was a recession, but it seemed like it wasn't to be blamed by a drop in aggregate demand. Instead, it was possibly about supply. So neoclassical economics are defined by the belief that, first of all, the long run macroeconomic picture is going to be good. The invisible hand is going to solve problems. It's the short-term fluctuations that can cause the pain. And so many of the solutions focus on the supply part of the economy, aggregate supply. This neoclassical model can include people that believe in the classics, basically, like Adam Smith, or they can also believe in policies that stimulate the economy through the Federal Reserve and the money supply. That's a monetarist economics. And then there are those that think the government should get involved and start to stimulate the supply part of the economy directly, which is known as supply side economics or Reaganomics. But we'll talk about each of these later. Gross domestic product is the value of the output of all the goods and services produced within a country's borders. So everything within the United States. So the Toyota factory in Tennessee is a Japanese company, but it's making products within the United States, so that's included within the GDP. The Ford factory in Mexico, even though it's an American company, is not included within the GDP. So it can be measured either by the total volume or value of what consumers purchase or the total value of what the country produces. So who buys all of a country's production? The demand can be divided into these four main parts. So consumption is one of them. So we talked about that, the consumption of people, for instance, business spending, which includes investment, and then government spending on goods and services. So these are the three spenders that contribute to the aggregate demand. Consumer spending, business spending, government spending, and then spending on net exports. And so this involves, of course, the trade balance and whether or not you're exporting or importing more. And here we can see a percentage of the components here. So consumption makes up almost 69%, so over 2/3. Investment makes up almost 17%. Government makes up also almost 18%. Exports make up 11.8%, and imports make up 14.5%. Notice that imports are greater than exports. So actually the trade balance doesn't exist. It's a trade deficit. So you actually end up taking off numbers here since the negatives are greater. But anyway, all of these are added up, and once again, these two combined make up totally a negative number. And so you would add on that negative number here, which decreases the GDP. But you can see that consumption makes overall half of the economy. So making sure that consumers are purchasing is important. Consumer confidence is important. Making sure that people are going out and shopping typically is important. The holiday season, Christmas, is incredibly important to this graph. Components of the GDP on the demand side. And so you can see how consumption has been pretty high for a while, probably throughout most of the 20th century. So 60%. Just gone up a little bit, but it's been in the 60% range over that time. Government also been fairly stable, around 20%, but I think you can guess it, before the Great Depression, it was much, much lower. And then investment. This fluctuates a bit, but it has stayed between 10 and 20%. Imports and exports. Both of them have risen, but notice the imports has risen faster and that we have had almost a permanent trade deficit since around 1975. So consumption is about 2/3 of GDP. Business is around 15% of GDP, but it increases and declines more than consumption. And government spending on goods and services is around 20%. Exports are added to the total demand for goods and services, while imports are subtracted. So as I said before, it's more than just a wash because the imports actually end up being greater. So the trade, so to speak, the net exports actually ends up being negative. So since 1975, it's been subtracting from the gross domestic product. The GDP net export component or trade balance is equal to the dollar value of exports minus the dollar value of imports. So the trade balance would be X exports, minus M, imports. A trade surplus is when a country's exports are larger than its imports. This hasn't happened for a while now. Trade deficit is when a country's imports exceed exports. So this is what's been happening since 1975. Based on the four components of demand, GDP can be measured through the following. Consumption, or C, plus investment, or I, plus government, or G, plus the trade balance, X minus M, so exports minus the imports. Production can be divided into these areas. Durable goods are things that last for a long period of time. Non-durable goods are short-lived, things that wear out pretty easily. Services are intangible. They are things that we provide for each other. They're not an actual product that you can hold in your hands, like entertainment, healthcare, education. Structures are buildings used as residence, like the school building, for instance, or one of the buildings downtown. Change in inventories is good that has been produced but not been sold yet. So it's on a stock shelf somewhere in a warehouse or something like that. Every market transaction must have both a buyer and the seller. So GDP must be the same whether measured by what is demanded or what is produced. So demanded is by the buyer, the seller is what is produced. So looking at those components, we can see that services make up a huge portion of the economy now, 62.4%. Structures, 8.1%, durable goods, 16.1%, and non-durable would be 13.4%. So services make up the biggest bulk of that in the United States. Types of production. Services are the largest single component, as you can see here. Even the way back to 1960, they made up almost 45%. They have been steadily increasing over 20% since 1960. Non-durable goods have been coming down. Why is that? As agricultural technology and science measures have increased, that has caused the food supply to go up, which has, of course, dropped prices. As supply goes up, prices drop. And so that continues to go down. Non-durable goods make up a smaller and smaller amount. And then durable goods have stayed about even. Even if you look at the higher prices today for things like stoves and fridges and that, if you adjust for inflation, you can see that hasn't changed much. So it stayed about even as a percentage. And then structures have gone down a little bit. You can see they've gone between 10% and maybe 7 or 8% here. So not a big fluctuation, but they have dipped. They slowly declined here, and then they declined again after 2005. So non-durable goods used to be larger than durable goods. So you can see at this point here, and then definitely by 1975, once again that year, we can see that they flipped places. Durable goods moved above that. Non-durable goods have continued to drop. And they went up a little bit here again, maybe plateaued, but the question is, will they drop again? Well, if there is another dramatic increase in technological or scientific advancement and understanding, then you'll see non-durable goods drop even further. Final goods and services are output used directly for consumption, so it's ready to go. Goods at the furthest stage of production. Intermediate goods are output provided to other businesses at an intermediate stage. So a bakery, for instance, buys flour, it buys sugar, that's an intermediate good. The donuts that they're ready to sell right out in their storefront is a final good and service. Double counting is output that is counted more than once as it travels through the stage of production, a potential mistake to avoid in measuring GDP. So GDP should not take into account the same thing twice. So it can't count the value of the flour and sugar, and then also take into account the value of the donut. GDP is a dollar value of all final goods and services, so it should only take this into account. The gross national product, which I mentioned earlier, which we used back, for instance, during the time of the Great Depression, includes what is produced domestically and what is produced by domestic labor and businesses abroad in a year. So back then, if we were still using the GMP today, for instance, back like we did back then it would not include the Toyota factory. It would include perhaps the work that the laborers did. It would include, however, the Ford factory in Mexico. And so as globalization has occurred more and more often, this number became a little bit more unpredictable or unreliable, I should say. Net national product is the GNP minus the value of depreciation. So that is subtracting the decreased value of our material on hand. So the process by which capital ages over time, therefore loses value. You hear that a lot for cars or houses. Its depreciating value is not worth as much, it's not in the same state. So the NNP, or net national product, can be further subdivided into national income. It includes all income earners, wages, profits, rent, and profit income. So these are all an income approach, for instance, to looking at the total picture of a country. Nominal value is the statistic that is actually announced at the time, and it's not adjusted for inflation, so it's raw. Real value is the economic statistic after adjusted for inflation. So if we have a $1 trillion GDP one year and next year it's $1.013 trillion and the inflation rate was 1.3%, then obviously we haven't produced more. The only reason why it's higher is because of inflation. So that would be a false sense of improvement when in fact it really hasn't gone up at all. And so they try to adjust that with the real value, and that's why it's more important. So here's the nominal GDP values from 1960 to the year 2010. So this is nominal GDP in billions of dollars. So this would be 2 billion, 4 billion, 6 billion, up to 16 billion over time. And there you can see it going up. The GDP deflator is a price index measuring the average prices of all goods and services, including the economy. Much like the nominal GDP, the GDP deflator has risen exponentially from 1960 through 2010. So there you can see it going from 20 units almost up to 120 units over time. So also increasing quite a bit if you look at these two in comparison. So the real GDP, that is that adjusted for inflation, is the nominal GDP, the raw number, divided by the price index. So you're going to take these numbers, the nominal GDP, divided by the price index, the tracking of inflation in units, which is the GDP deflator. So they point out here, price index is the same as GDP inflator. For simplicity, the price index is traditionally published after being multiplied by 100 in order to get an integer number. So remember to divide the published price index by 100 when doing the math. Whenever a real statistic is computed for 1 year or another period of time, it is called the base year. The base year is the year whose prices we use to compute the real statistic, so the one that we use to compare to. So here we have 1960, a nominal GDP, raw GDP in billions of dollars, $543.3 billion. The deflator is 19 units. So the calculation is 543.3 divided by 19. And of course, remember to take that 100 into account. So the real GDP in billions of dollars would be 2.859 billion. So in other words, it'd be 2,859 billion, or $2 trillion. And so in 1960, back then they said, hey, what was, in 1961, they'll say, hey, what was the GDP? It was 543 billion. Wow, that's impressive. But looking at it today, wow, that looks tiny. But if we take inflation into account, we can see that it was actually a little bit higher than that. So if we go back to here, we look at it, it's like, oh, that was really low. It was only 500 some billion dollars, but actually it was higher than that. If we adjust for inflation, it's going to be up above here. And so there they have the calculation for you. 543.3 divided by 19 divided by 100 is 2,859 billion, which is 2 trillion. And they use 2005 as the base year. To calculate the real GDP in 2010, we do the same thing. So we take the nominal raw GDP of $14.9 trillion divided by the GDP deflator of 110, calculated based on 2005, and that we see it's actually $13.5 trillion, using 2005 as the base year. And so here's the nominal GDP and the real GDP. Nominal is purple, real GDP is blue. So this is the number that we saw earlier, and this is the real GDP here. So we adjust for inflation. Of course, it's dipping down below because remember we used 2005 as the base year. So, it still has grown. The real GDP still has grown, but it was higher than we thought before at each of these stages. And once again, the only reason why it isn't here is because we used 2005 as the base year. So calculating the real GDP growth rate. So how much did it grow? So what was the real GDP growth rate from 1960 to 2010? So we take the 2010 real GDP minus that of 1960 and divide it by 1960's rate, times 100, of course, to get the percentage change. And so we can see the numbers here. 13,598 minus 2,859.5 divided by that original number times 100 equals 376%. So that is the real GDP growth rate over that time period from 1960 to 2010. Governments report the GDP growth as an annualized rate, so they go by year. When analyzing growth rate in a quarter, the calculated growth in real GDP for the quarter is multiplied by 4 when it is reported, as if the economy were growing at that rate for a full year. So they get it in pieces by quarter, but then they take it by 4 because they do year comparisons. So they basically assume, this is the rate it would be growing at for an entire year. A recession is a significant decline in national output or GDP for 2 consecutive quarters or 6 months altogether. And so if there's a contraction that only occurs for a month, and that's possible, it's not referred to as a recession. And we don't even usually know about it until a month later or maybe more. A depression is extremely lengthy and deep decline in output that lasts for multiple years, or they don't have necessarily a clear definition of that. So the U.S. GDP from 1900 to 2016, this is in real GDP numbers, so adjusted for inflation. You can see it's gone up considerably. And so remember, this is adjusted for inflation. So you might be looking at this number saying, wow, things didn't really cost that much back then. But remember, it is adjusted for current dollars, or at least as of real GDP in the United States in 2016, in 2009 dollars. So this would be in 2009, which is, and the reason why they use that is because, of course, there was a recession at that time. But we can see, even adjusted for that, the GDP has grown enormously. So after adjusting to remove the effects of inflation, this represents a roughly 20-fold increase in economic production throughout the 20th century into the early 21st century. So looking at the business cycle, and we can see the business cycle. It's kind of hard to see when it's expanded outward like this over a century, but we can see it a little bit here. This is an expansionary period. This would be a peak. Then we have a contractionary period and a trough when it bottoms out. And then we go back expanding again. So the peak is the high point in the business cycle. The trough is the low point. A recession lasts from peak to trough, and an economic upswing runs from trough to peak. And so the totality of this is referred to as the business cycle. Not all of them are the same. From a zoomed out view, like I said, we can't see it as well. This one is not the same shape as this one, is not the same shape as this one, as these. So they can be a little bit different. Like I said earlier, if it's less than 6 months, then it's generally not regarded as a recession. It's just a brief blip that occurs. To compare the GDP of countries with different currencies, it is necessary to convert a common denominator using an exchange rate or a value or price of currency in terms of another currency. And typically, the American dollar is used for that exchange rate. So if you compare Brazil's GDP in 2013 of 4.8 trillion reals with the US GDP of 16.6 trillion for the same year, in 2013, the exchange rate was 2.157 reals equal to $1. So we convert the GDP into US dollars. So the Brazil GDP in their own currency divided by the exchange rate. So 4.845 trillion divided by the exchange rate of 2.157. Once again, we're comparing it to US dollars to convert it into American dollars. And so that's 2.246 trillion GDP in American dollars. So we first see this number, it might be reported in the country's currency. So this looks like, wow, that's impressive. But if you compare it to American dollars, it's not as high. It's still pretty impressive. That's still pretty good. So we compare this value to the GDP in the United States in the same year. The U.S. GDP was 16.6 trillion in 2013, which is nearly 8 times that of the GDP in Brazil, but they do have a smaller population, although it is one of the larger ones in the world. The U.S. economy has the largest GDP in the world and is also a populous country, the third most populated. Is this economy also larger on a per person basis? So the GDP per capita is the GDP divided by the population. So per capita is per head. So the standard of living, all elements that affect people's happiness and well-being, whether they are bought and sold in the market or not. The difference between GDP and standard of living should be taken in consideration because GDP is not always the same thing as standard of living. A country might have a huge GDP, but the question is the standard of living that high? And so the GDP doesn't take into consideration some things that we look at when it comes to standard of living, like leisure time, relaxation, luxury, actual levels of environmental cleanliness. Is the air so choked with dirt that you can see it when you breathe? You might have a good GDP, but if you're choking on your own air, it's probably not that good of a standard of living. Production that is not exchanged in the market, so anything that goes on in households, people that do their own chores instead of hiring someone to come clean for them, people that mow their own yards instead of hiring a landscaper. All of that is not included in the GDP. The level of inequality in society, so how goods or maybe even income is distributed. If you have $1 trillion GDP and one person makes $950 billion a year, then obviously your standard of living probably isn't that great. What technology and products are available? So if you have very basic technology, no computers, the majority occupation and industry in a country is coal, and then the country next to it is a computer-based system where most people work in computers or services, and they both those countries have $1 trillion GDP. They might look equal GDP-wise, but probably the computer-based country has a better standard of living. And when we look at this number here, the GDP per capita, we can see that the United States is still pretty high. The United States, for instance, for the year 2020, this is just an estimate, and this is from the International Monetary Fund, an international organization that helps with exchange rates, for instance. And they have the GDP per capita for the United States at $63,051 a year, which is in fifth place. We're behind Norway, Ireland, Switzerland, and Luxembourg. They actually go up considerably. Norway is only 4,000 higher. Ireland is 79. Switzerland is roughly 81, and Luxembourg is 109. And you might think, wow, that's pretty high. Well, there's one other thing that it doesn't take into consideration. So we do still pretty well considering the number of people we have. We're in fifth place. China is in second place with GDP. But if we look at their per capita, because remember they have 1 billion more people than us. We have 325 million. They have 1.3 some billion. So they have 1 billion more people. And if we look at China, they have a per capita of $10,839. They're in 59th place. So are they as productive? The answer is no. India is in the top 15 in GDPs, but when you divide into their population, it's only $1,877. They're 142nd place when you compare it, when you take in consideration how many people they have. Now, another thing that it doesn't take in consideration, that it doesn't mention here in the PowerPoint, in the text, is purchasing power parity. And so that looks at how much can you buy with the money that you have. So if we look at purchasing power parity, so how much they can buy, that can actually change a little bit more. The United States it depends on who calculates it, but we can change from 7th to 8th place depending upon that. And that's based on how expensive things are and what we can buy. But it does flip some countries around because obviously in some of the countries you can make a lower income but buy more with it. And so that also has to be taken into consideration as well. But those are just some of the different macroeconomic factors that can be looked at in the statistics, particularly GDP and some problems with it, and also different ways that we can take it and divide up the numbers based on population, for instance, and come up with a slightly different way of determining whether or not a country is better off.